We arrived at the cabin just after noon on Friday. It was tucked deep in the Welsh countryside, surrounded by dense woods and miles from the nearest town. Perfect, we thought, for a quiet weekend away. There were 5 of us, me, Mark, Rachel, Andy and Sarah. We'd pooled together to rent the place, an old stone lodge with a sloping roof and ivy creeping up the walls. It was charming in that rustic, slightly run-down way that makes you think of fireplaces and mugs of tea. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, made a big dinner and spent the evening drinking and laughing around the fire. By the time we went to bed, the sky was a mess of stars, the woods outside pitch black. It felt safe, cozy even. Saturday started off well enough, but by mid-afternoon the mood had shifted. Andy and Mark got into it over something stupid, cards I think. It wasn't serious, but tempers flared, and Andy stomped off into the woods to cool down. We figured he'd be back soon. He wasn't the kind to hold a grudge. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, he still hadn't returned. At first we joked about it, imagining him sulking by a stream or sitting on a log somewhere. But as the hours dragged on, the jokes stopped. We tried calling him, but our phones had no signal. That wasn't surprising. We'd known the place was remote. Mark suggested we drive down to the nearest village to see if anyone had seen him. But when we got to the car, we found the tires slashed. It didn't make sense. The car had been fine when we arrived. We'd parked it just outside the cabin in plain view from the windows. None of us had heard or seen anything. Rachel thought it might have been a wild animal, but the cuts were too clean, the work of a knife or something similar. That's when the unease really started to settle in. The cabin, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, the silence outside deeper. Mark grabbed a torch and the 4 of us set off into the woods to look for Andy. We didn't want to split up, not after the car, so we stuck close together, calling his name as we walked. The woods were unsettling at night. The torchlight picked out branches that loomed like skeletal fingers, and every snap of a twig made us freeze. The trees seemed to press in tighter the further we went, their bark streaked with moss that glistened in the beam of the torch. We found no sign of Andy, no footprints, no snapped branches to show where he might have gone. The only sound was the wind sifting through the leaves and the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. After about an hour, Sarah spotted something hanging from a low branch. It was Andy's scarf, knotted around the wood like a flag. It didn't look torn or snagged, it just tied neatly. Rachel said it was a good sign that he must have left it for us to follow, but I didn't like it. The knot was tight, too precise for someone who was lost or wandering aimlessly. Mark untied it and we carried on. We found more of his things as we walked. A glove, his beanie, even his wallet, left open on a rock. It was as if he was shedding pieces of himself, breadcrumbs to lead us somewhere. But the further we went, the less it felt like we were following Andy. The items were spaced too far apart, almost as if they'd been placed with purpose. The trail led us deeper into the woods, far from the path where the trees grew so close together it was hard to tell which way we'd come. Then we saw the cabin. It was different from ours, older and smaller, half collapsed under the weight of years. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. The windows were shattered and the walls were covered in deep gouges, as if something had clawed at the wood. None of us wanted to go inside, but Mark insisted. We couldn't see Andy's trail anymore, and he thought he might be sheltering there. The inside was worse. The air was damp and foul, with the smell of rot. A few broken pieces of furniture were scattered around, along with what looked like animal bones. We didn't stay long. Mark called for Andy, his voice echoing strangely in the small space, but there was no answer. We left the cabin and started back, or at least we tried to. The torch flickered, then died, and in the dark the woods all looked the same. The paths we'd followed seemed to vanish, and no matter which way we turned, we ended up somewhere unfamiliar. By the time we'd stumbled back into the clearing with our cabin, it was nearly dawn. Andy wasn't there. The fire we'd left burning was out, and the cabin door was wide open. Inside, the furniture had been overturned, our belongings strewn across the floor. We never found Andy. It was late when I booked the ride share, the kind of late where the streets are empty and the orange glow of the street lights feels oddly claustrophobic. I'd had a few drinks, but nothing over the top, just enough to make the idea of a bus seem unbearable. The app told me a driver named Alan would be picking me up, a silver saloon car. He arrived in less than 5 minutes and I slid into the back seat, grateful for the ride. Alan looked normal enough, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a faded polo shirt. He greeted me cheerfully, his voice carrying that overly familiar tone some drivers have, like they think of themselves as your mate rather than a stranger ferrying you from A to B. At first it seemed harmless. He asked how my night had been, whether I lived far from the pub I'd just left. Standard small talk, but it didn't stop there. He started asking more personal questions. What I did for work, if I lived alone, whether I'd been out with a boyfriend. I laughed it off, keeping my answers vague, and stared out of the window, watching the buildings blur past. The air inside the car felt stuffy, despite the window being cracked open. I could feel his eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror, watching me more often than seemed necessary. He made a comment about how quiet the streets were, how no one would notice if something happened. I told myself it was just a clumsy joke, the kind people make without thinking. Still, my grip tightened on my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency button in the app. I started mentally tracing the route we were taking, checking that we were heading the right way. When we finally pulled up outside my flat, I got out quickly, muttering a hurried thanks. As I shut the car door, he leaned out of the window and said, "Take care of yourself." There was something about the way he said it that left a sour feeling in my stomach, like the words were coated in something I couldn't quite place. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. The message was short. My chest tightened. I knew it had to be him. I hadn't given him my number, and yet here it was. I didn't reply, deleting the message and blocking the number. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a driver who'd overstepped a boundary. But it didn't stop there. That evening I saw his car parked across the street from my flat. He wasn't inside, at least not that I could see, but it was unmistakable. Same silver saloon, same license plate. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence that maybe he had another fare in the area. But it didn't feel like one. Over the next few days I started seeing him everywhere. His car would be parked on the corner when I left for work. I spotted him standing at the entrance of the supermarket while I was picking up groceries. Once I caught him across the street as I was coming back from a jog, just standing there watching. I went to the police, but they weren't much help. Without direct threats or evidence of harm, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to be cautious and to keep a record of any further incidents. That was it. One night I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing, another message from an unknown number. My hands shook as I blocked the number. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows twice before going back to bed, but sleep didn't come. The next time I saw him was late in the evening. His car was parked in its usual spot, but this time he was sitting inside. The cabin light was on, and he was staring straight at my window. I couldn't move. I stood there, half hidden behind the curtain, watching him watch me. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but he didn't move. No matter how many times I told myself to call the police again, my hand wouldn't reach for the phone. I just stood there, frozen, until the light in his car went off and the street was dark once more. That was 3 days ago. Now, every time I step outside, I feel his eyes on me, even when I can't see him. I've stopped leaving the flat unless I absolutely have to. I've taped over the letterbox, locked every door, closed every curtain, but it doesn't matter. Last night, I found a note slipped under my door. No envelope, no signature, just a few words scrawled in shaky handwriting. I'm still here. The cabin looked perfect as we drove up the dirt track. A quaint little place surrounded by trees with a wraparound porch and smoke curling gently from the chimney. That last detail gave me pause. Had the property manager lit the fire for us? But then I thought maybe it was part of the service. A warm welcome for a romantic weekend away. Jenny was already unloading the car, smiling in a way that made me forget any doubts. She'd booked the place as a surprise after all. I figured she had everything sorted. Inside, the cabin was cozy, almost too perfect, like something out of a magazine. Wooden beams, a plush rug in front of the hearth, and a faint scent of pine in the air. The fire was still burning, low embers glowing in the grate. A basket of firewood sat nearby, neatly arranged. I thought it was odd, but shrugged it off. Then there was the fridge. We hadn't brought much with us, just a bag of groceries for the weekend. But when I opened the door, I saw it was half-stocked. Milk, butter, a few beers, even a block of cheese wrapped in wax paper. I called out to Jenny, asking if she'd arranged for supplies to be left for us, but she just looked as puzzled as I felt. The muddy boots by the door were the strangest thing. 2 pairs, one large, one small, caked in dried mud. They looked as if they'd been left there in a hurry. Jenny thought they must belong to the property manager, but something about them made me uneasy. Why leave them behind? And why was the mud so fresh? We spent the afternoon settling in, and for a while the unease faded. The woods around the cabin were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, just the whisper of wind through the trees. Jenny loved it. She kept talking about how peaceful it was, how it felt like we were a million miles from everything. As night fell, the fire crackled in the hearth, and we opened a bottle of wine. The cabin felt warm and inviting, even if the woods outside seemed to grow darker than they should have. We locked the door, closed the curtains, and curled up on the sofa. For a while, everything felt right. It was the sound that woke me, a creak of wood, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I thought it was the floor settling, maybe a branch brushing against the roof. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. Jenny was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I got up as quietly as I could, every step on the wooden floor seeming louder than it should have been. The cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, reassured myself everything was secure. But as I turned back towards the bedroom, I noticed something. The muddy boots by the door were gone. I froze, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe I'd moved them earlier and forgotten. But the space where they had been was empty, save for a faint smear of mud on the floor. That's when I noticed the fire. The embers were brighter, as if someone had added fresh wood. The room smelled faintly of smoke and pine, stronger than before. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here, maybe was still here. I went back to the bedroom and shook Jenny awake, whispering what I'd seen. She didn't believe me at first, thought I was imagining things, but then we heard it. The sound of footsteps, faint and steady, coming from just outside the cabin. We stayed still, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled the cabin. They were measured, purposeful, moving from one side to the other. At one point, they stopped right outside the window. I felt sure whoever was out there could hear the thudding of my heart. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. We didn't move for a long time, listening for any sign they might come back. When we finally worked up the courage to peek outside, there was no one there, but the muddy boots were back, neatly placed by the door, with fresh mud dripping from their soles. In the morning, we packed up and left. The cabin seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, hidden among the trees. Jenny checked her emails on the way back, scrolling through her booking confirmation. She stopped abruptly, her face pale. The email wasn't from a rental company, it was from a private address, with no contact details and no cancellation policy. We didn't talk much after that. All I could think about were the embers in the fire and the boots by the door. We set out early, the air crisp and sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. There were 4 of us, me, Pete, Liz, and Anna. A multi-day hike along the southwest coast path had seemed like a good idea, a way to disconnect, breathe in some fresh air, and feel like we'd accomplished something by the end of it. We packed light, but enough to last, double-checked the weather, and hit the trail full of that naive optimism that always seems to fade after the first day. The trail was beautiful in that rugged, unforgiving way only the British coastline can be. Jagged cliffs plunged into the sea. The wind carried the salt in heavy waves, and the paths twisted through thickets of gorse and heather. We didn't see many other walkers, just the odd lone hiker passing us with a nod, always going the other way. It was late afternoon on the second day when we found the campsite. At first it seemed like a lucky break. There was a clearing just off the trail, shielded by a half-circle of trees. A fire pit, some logs arranged as seats, and a couple of old tarps draped over branches for makeshift shelter. But the closer we got, the more it felt wrong. The camp looked abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't tidy, like someone had packed up and moved on, nor was it chaotic, like it had been ransacked by animals. It was just left. A half-empty tin of beans sat next to the fire pit. A mug lay on its side, and a rucksack leaned against a tree, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no sign of whoever had been there. It was Pete who found the journal, stuffed into the rucksack, along with some clothes and supplies. It was small, bound in worn leather, the pages warped slightly from damp. None of us really wanted to read it, but Pete flicked through, and curiosity got the better of him. We gathered around as he read aloud. The entries started out ordinary enough. A hiker traveling solo, writing about the weather, the views, the solitude. Then halfway through, the tone shifted. The writer mentioned feeling uneasy, like they were being watched. They started noticing little things, footprints in the dirt that didn't match their boots, the crack of a twig somewhere behind them, shadows where there shouldn't have been any. They tried to brush it off, telling themselves it was paranoia or exhaustion, but the entries became shorter, more frantic. By the end, the handwriting was shaky and erratic. The last line read, simply, "It's not just in my head, it's real." We didn't talk about it much after that, just exchanged awkward looks and set up our tents a little further up the trail. None of us wanted to stay near that campsite. The wind picked up as we worked, rattling through the trees, and by the time we settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling we'd made a mistake. The noises started after the sun went down. At first it was just the usual rustling you hear on a windy night, branches creaking, leaves shifting. But then there were other sounds, closer and harder to explain. Footsteps, maybe crunching softly on the ground. A faint rhythmic tapping like someone drumming their fingers on bark. Once, I thought I heard breathing, low and steady, just outside my tent. None of us slept much that night, and by the time dawn broke, we were packed and ready to move on. Liz tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the wind or an animal. We all agreed, but I think we knew better. The third day was worse. We were jumpy, turning at every noise, scanning the trees for movement. Once or twice, I thought I caught a glimpse of something. A shape darting between the trunks, too far away to make out properly. I told myself it was a deer, but it moved too quietly, too purposefully. By the afternoon, the atmosphere between us had shifted. We were quieter, more focused on putting one foot in front of the other and getting off the trail. It didn't help that we kept finding little signs we weren't alone. A smudge of fresh mud on a rock, a snapped branch at head height, the faint impression of a boot in the dirt, not one of ours. That night, we didn't even bother pitching the tents. We just huddled in the clearing back to back, waiting for the sun to rise. The noises didn't stop this time. They grew closer, circling us, always just out of sight. Once, I swear I saw a hand, the pale blur of fingers curling around a tree trunk, before it vanished again. When morning came, we didn't speak. We just packed up and kept moving, barely pausing to eat or drink. The trail seemed endless, winding on, the trees pressing in closer with every step. By the time we reached the end of the trail, the sun was dipping low again, casting everything in shadow. We didn't talk about what we saw, what we heard, or what might still be out there. But I know this, when we got back to civilization, none of us looked over our shoulders. We didn't need to. Whatever it was, it didn't need to follow us. It was already in our heads. When I inherited the house, I was under no illusions about what I was getting. It wasn't a windfall, not in the way some people dream about. The place was a crumbling relic on the outskirts of some nowhere town in Somerset, sagging under the weight of decades without care, but it was mine, and I figured I'd do something with it. Maybe fix it up and rent it out, or sell it on for whatever I could get. I hired a contractor named Neil to help me gut the place. He wasn't cheap, but he came highly recommended and didn't ask too many questions when I showed him around. The house was bigger than I'd remembered, sprawling out awkwardly with narrow hallways and odd corners that didn't seem to match the exterior. A mishmash of extensions and renovations done over the years, no doubt. It was ugly, but it had potential, or so I told myself. The first few days were uneventful. Neil and his crew ripped out rotten boards, stripped wallpaper that peeled away like dead skin, and knocked down sagging plaster walls. The house gave up its secrets begrudgingly. Old newspapers stuffed into cracks for insulation, a rusted tin of biscuits tucked into a crawl space, and once an old pocket watch that didn't work anymore. Then we found the hidden room. It was Neil who uncovered it behind a false wall in what I'd assumed was the pantry. There was no sign it had ever been a part of the house, no door or frame to give it away. Just a patch of brick that didn't match the rest, covered over with plaster. Inside was a space barely large enough to stand in, with walls lined in some kind of padded material that had long since decayed. The air inside was wrong. Stale, yes, but almost too still, as if it had been sealed off for longer than the house had existed. Neil gave me a look when he saw it. I shrugged, pretending I wasn't as unnerved as he clearly was. I told him to move on, and we did. But the discovery stuck with me, a splinter in the back of my mind. Over the next few days, more rooms emerged. They were all the same. Hidden spaces with padded walls and no windows, barely large enough to fit a single person. Some had rusted metal rings embedded in the floors. Neil muttered something about old asylum practices, but it didn't sit right. These weren't hospital cells. They were too crude, too small. They felt personal, in a way that made my skin crawl. By the end of the week, Neil's crew had cleared out most of the debris, and I started spending more time at the house. I told myself it was to save money on labor, but the truth was I wanted to keep an eye on things. The house had begun to feel strange, not, haunted exactly, but like it was watching me. I brushed it off as my imagination, the kind of creeping unease that comes from working in a place with no power or proper light. Then I heard the noises. It started at night after Neil and his crew had gone home. I stayed late to patch some holes in the plaster and heard what sounded like shuffling, faint and irregular. At first I thought it was rats or some other pest, but there was a rhythm to it, something too deliberate for animals. It seemed to come from inside the walls, moving from room to room. I searched the house, torch in hand, but found nothing. The next morning I noticed scratches on the floorboards in one of the hidden rooms. They hadn't been there before, long, shallow grooves that formed a crude pattern, almost like writing. I told myself Neil's crew must have made them by accident. That same day, Neil called to say he couldn't come back. No explanation, just that he was pulling out of the job. I didn't blame him. I tried to finish the work myself. But the house had other ideas. Doors I swore I'd closed were left open when I returned. Tools went missing, only to turn up in strange places, under floorboards, behind walls, in those damned hidden rooms. The noises grew louder, more insistent, and now they weren't confined to the walls. I heard them behind me when I worked, just out of sight, and sometimes they sounded like breathing. The final straw came when I found the photographs. They were buried in a small box beneath the floorboards of what I'd started calling the main cell. Black and white images, grainy and yellowed with age, showing men and women chained to the walls. Their faces were obscured, but their postures spoke volumes, arched backs, twisted limbs, silent screams. I left the house that night and haven't been back. The place still stands, as far as I know, waiting for someone braver or more foolish than me to uncover the rest of its secrets. I've thought about burning it down, but something tells me it wouldn't make a difference. Some things aren't meant to be forgotten. I'd never been one for grandeur, but the money was good, and the idea of spending a few months in a luxury home sounded better than the alternative. They said the owners were abroad and the house needed someone to keep an eye on things during the off-season. A straightforward job. Keep the place clean, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, and report anything unusual. The house itself was perched on the edge of a forest overlooking a still grey lake. It was modern and sprawling, with floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed to drink in the landscape, the kind of place designed to impress rather than comfort. It didn't feel much like a home. Still, I'd never stayed anywhere so posh before. The kitchen had appliances I didn't know how to use, and the master bathroom had a tub so large it could double as a swimming pool. For the first week, I felt like a kid playing at being rich. The first odd thing was minor. I'd unpacked a week's worth of groceries and stocked the fridge. By the following morning, a few items were missing. Nothing major, a couple of eggs, a carton of milk slightly emptier than I remembered. At first, I thought I must have been careless. Maybe I'd miscounted. But it happened again. Bread slices gone, an apple I was certain I'd bought nowhere to be found. The wet footprints came next. They appeared in the hallway one morning, leading from the back door to the staircase. It had rained the night before, but I hadn't been outside. The back door was locked, just as I'd left it. I checked it twice to be sure. Maybe I'd missed them when I was cleaning, I thought. Maybe they'd been there all along. But that didn't explain the water, fresh, as if someone had only just stepped through. I cleaned them up and made a point to check every door and window before going to bed. Everything was locked tight. But the following morning, there were more. This time, they led into the kitchen, stopping abruptly by the refrigerator. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I stared at the spot where they ended. I'd been thorough, but I checked the house again. Every room, every closet, even the attic. Nothing was out of place. I thought about calling the agency that had hired me. But what would I say, that I couldn't handle a bit of paranoia? That would be the end of the job for sure, so I stayed quiet and convinced myself it was nothing. That night, I woke to the sound of something faint. At first I thought it was the wind. The house had a way of creaking as if it were alive, the big windows shifting and settling with the temperature. But this was different. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. I held my breath and strained to listen. It seemed to come from somewhere below. I got up and moved quietly, my feet barely touching the floor. The house felt vast in the dark, every shadow stretched and looming. The sound grew louder as I reached the staircase. I'd left a lamp on in the living room, but the bulb flickered and died just as I reached the bottom step. The air felt colder down here. My skin prickled as I crossed the living room to the kitchen. It was empty as far as I could tell, but the refrigerator door was open slightly. I closed it and turned around, my heart hammering. That's when I noticed the patio doors. The curtains swayed slightly as if someone had brushed past them. The doors were locked, but the footprints were back, damp and gleaming in the faint light from the hallway. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat in the armchair in the corner of the bedroom, facing the door, the bat I'd found in the garage resting across my lap. I thought about leaving, but my pride wouldn't let me. I'd stay another night, one more, maybe two. The next day, I avoided the house as much as possible. I took a long walk by the lake and tried to clear my head. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. The house loomed against the red sky, its windows reflecting the dying light like a row of empty eyes. I hesitated before going in. The kitchen was wrong, not messy, not broken, just wrong. Chairs weren't where I'd left them. A cup sat on the counter that I hadn't used. The refrigerator door was open again, and this time the food was scattered across the floor. I closed the door and backed out slowly, my heart thudding. I barely slept that night. Every creak and whisper of the house seemed amplified. I told myself it was just an old building, the wind, the pipes, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight. The last morning I woke to find the front door standing wide open. I didn't remember unlocking it. I'd checked it the night before, I was sure of that. There were no footprints this time, no sign of anything disturbed, just the door, yawning open as if inviting me out. I packed my things and left before noon. I didn't bother cleaning or locking up. I drove until the house was far behind me, the lake and the forest swallowed by the distance. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see those footprints, stopping just short of where I stood. I'd spent years preparing, years of saving, planning, stockpiling. The bunker was my masterpiece, dug deep beneath the back garden, reinforced concrete and steel. It was my insurance policy against the coming storm, the societal collapse I was convinced was just around the corner. Then it happened, or at least I thought it had. The news was full of unrest, rising tensions, whispers of something big about to break. I made the call. It was time. I locked the hatch, sealed myself in, and descended into the earth. The initial days were almost comfortable. I had everything I needed: food, water, a generator for power, even a small library of books. I organized my supplies, established a routine. It was like a strange underground camping trip. Then things started to go missing. It was subtle at the beginning, a few tins of beans here, a couple of bottles of water there. I put it down to miscounting, a lapse in my meticulous inventory. But it kept happening. More food vanished, batteries for the radio disappeared. Even a thick wool blanket went missing from my bunk. I started checking the bunker, searching for signs of forced entry. But the hatch was still sealed tight, the walls solid. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Then came the noises. At night, when the generator was off and the bunker was plunged into near total darkness, I'd hear them. Faint scrapes and rustles, like something moving just beyond the concrete walls. Sometimes I'd hear a soft tapping, as if someone was gently knocking on the other side of the earth. I checked the ventilation system, thinking maybe the sounds were coming from outside, but the vents were fitted with heavy-duty filters designed to keep out everything from dust to chemical agents. Nothing could get through. The noises became more frequent, more insistent. The scraping grew louder, the tapping more rhythmic. One night, I heard a distinct dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ground just above me. I spent my nights huddled in my bunk, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept a heavy wrench beside me, my only weapon. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just settling of the earth, the bunker shifting in the ground. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. One morning, I woke to find a fresh set of muddy footprints on the concrete floor near the storage area. They weren't mine. They were small, almost childlike. The hatch remained sealed. I checked it several times. There was no way in or out other than that single heavy steel door. I stared at the footprints and then up at the vent. It was still firmly in place. I looked back at the footprints, which seemed to lead towards the back wall, and then simply stopped. I haven't slept properly in days. The noises continue. The supplies keep disappearing. I'm down here alone in the dark, but I'm not sure I'm alone at all. The new flat was small, but it was mine, finally. It was in a big grey block called Elmwood Court, out on the edge of town. Not exactly glamorous, but the rent was cheap. The other tenants seemed normal enough, mostly young couples and single people like me. Then the moving started. It wasn't like proper moving. With vans and removal men, it was quieter, more furtive. I'd hear the rumble of a trolley in the corridor late at night, sometimes the muffled thud of boxes. Then in the morning another door would be empty, just a bare patch on the doormat where their shoes had been. It began with the flat across the hall. One day they were there, the next gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address slipped under my door, just gone. Then it was the old bloke downstairs, the one with the whippet, vanished. The whippet never barked again. I mentioned it to Mrs. Higgins, the woman in the flat next to mine. She just shook her head and clucked her tongue. Then I met Mark. He lived 2 floors up. We bumped into each other in the lift one afternoon and got talking. He seemed normal, friendly. He even admitted he'd noticed the strange departures. He told me to come up that evening. I went up at 8 sharp. The corridor on the 5th floor was eerily quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the lift mechanism, but nothing else. Mark's door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The flat was empty. Not just empty of Mark, but empty of everything. No furniture, no pictures on the walls, not even a rug on the floor. It was as if no one had ever lived there. Just bare walls and dust motes dancing in the weak light from the window. I went back downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I went to the management office, a poky little room by the main entrance. The manager, a thin man with slicked back hair, looked up from his paperwork. I stood there for a moment, staring at him. He just shrugged and went back to his paperwork. I walked out of the office and back towards my flat. The corridor seemed longer than usual, the shadows deeper. As I reached my door, I glanced back down the hallway. The door to the flat across from mine was now also slightly ajar.